European response to it. Just a few words from me before we get underway with our speakers. We have Maha Yahya, Dr. Maha Yahya, who is the director of the Carnegie Center in Beirut. And we have Ambassador Ralph Tariff, the EU ambassador to Lebanon, who will make the two interventions following this. Well, I suppose it's fair to say that Lebanon is still picking up the pieces 6 weeks on from the tragic events of early August. I don't know how many people have been made homeless, figures up to 300,000 they mentioned. It was already suffering from one of the worst economic crises to hit the country in modern times. A lot of anger in the street, a dysfunctional state, a discredited political elite, to the point where one's seen even during the demonstrations, people coming along with nooses around the necks of people like Mr. Nasrallah, who I think the leader of Hezbollah, who normally, of course, is somebody who doesn't get that kind of treatment. But the opposition seems to lack clear leadership. And of course, the new prime minister, Mustafa Adib, is trying to form a government. He doesn't seem to have been able to find a government just yet. But he's being accused by many as being a holdover from the old system. No doubt that there's a lot of reform that's going to be needed, and we'll talk about that. And of course, that's been underlined very strongly by President Macron, who's visited twice since the blast and has led the international effort to support the country. Now, one of the conditions, of course, for that support that he laid down was that a new government should have been in place by yesterday. It isn't. Quite what that will lead to is to be seen. But he has said that if the conditions are met, he will do everything he can to have a conference next month where possibly up to $25 billion in aid could be raised for the country. But to get there, there's an awful lot that he's doing in the meantime, not least on economic reform, the sectoral reforms, possibly elections within the next year, although that isn't sure. Maybe the speakers can tell us what they think about that. And a whole series of questions flow from this. Is this intervention by the French, by President Macron, something which is widely accepted in Lebanon? Is first question one would have, given the very prominent role that the former colonial power seems to be playing here. And on the EU side, keeping in mind that EU funding and political support will be a crucial factor. It looks like the institutions are on board. We'll hear more from Ralph about that. But what about the other member states? Will they rally to this French initiative? And other questions like the Syrian refugee population in Lebanon, more than 1 million, many worries about that, both humanitarian and possibly migration related fears as well. What about the Arab world? Will the Gulf states chip in to help out the country under these circumstances, given the role that Hezbollah will probably continue to play in the governance of the country? And what about Israel? Will it see the French plan as a way of bolstering stability on its southern border, or will they play spoiler and try to take advantage of a weakened Hezbollah to make the most of the situation from their point of view? There are 1,000 other questions, but let's turn first to our speakers for their analysis and maybe a few answers. And let me just say that if you wish to put a question in yourselves, the participants, could you please use the Q&A button, which you'll see at the bottom of the screen, and I'll do my level best to make sure that your question is taken up and put to the speakers. And with that, let us get on with the business, and let me ask Dr. Maha to lead us into the discussion. Over to you, Maha.
Hi, James. Thank you very much for having me on this panel, especially with my dear friend Ralph as well. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Just very briefly, I mean, you've already laid out more or less the highlights of what Lebanon is going through. It's obviously been going through a perfect storm of political, economic, financial, and now social crises. I wrote recently an article about how 4 out of the 5 key pillars in Lebanon are literally collapsing or on their way to collapsing. The political power sharing settlement that was forged at the end of, well, when Lebanon gained independence and then revised at the end of the civil war, is today in question. The political elite themselves, their own legitimacy is very much in question, at least across large swaths of the population, and in a way that has not been seen since the end of the civil war. The whole notion of the merchant republic, Lebanon was built on the idea of it being a merchant republic whose key pillars, economic, were banking and services, tourism. I mean, it was the Switzerland of the Middle East in different ways. The myth of you could ski and swim in the same day. All of this today is in question. The banking sector is a key a part of the economic crisis. Lebanon today, at least in the government plan, they were estimating that the country has an almost $80 billion hole. And that includes the central bank as well, which in any other circumstance would have been able to step in and address part of the economic crisis. In this situation, it can't. It itself has a very significant has played a significant role in the public debt that the country is today witnessing. It has the financial crisis is a balance of payments, but also a problem with the FX exchange. The Lebanese currency has lost close to 80% of its value since October 2019. What this effectively means is that the third pillar of kind of Lebanese identity or Lebanon holding up Lebanon is that its middle class, its entrepreneurial class is completely disappearing. With the loss of 80%, 70 to 80% of the value of the pound, the price of basic goods has doubled, tripled, quadrupled, and even more. Inflation is at an all-time high. But also, I mean, as part of this as well is that people are have lost actually, it's not that they're losing, they've lost their incomes and they've lost their pensions. Just to give one small illustration, an assistant professor at the American University of Beirut used to make, and this is the preeminent university in the country and probably in the region, they used to make close to $66,000 a year in Lebanese pounds. That salary, in dollar, it's the dollar value of that salary today is 11,000 pounds. Just to give a sense of how dramatic the decline has been for Lebanon's middle class. And as a result, we're seeing waves of immigration. I truly believe that if it wasn't for the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot more people would have left seeking jobs. People are leaving even without having any guarantees. For example, the Canadian embassy is reporting on historical numbers of people asking for, visas to go to Canada, but also to apply for Canadian citizenship. People are just leaving if they have the opportunity, especially the youngest and the brightest. A lot of doctors, the medical, the syndicate of doctors the other day came out and said there are significant, we're going to start facing shortages soon. Hospitalization or hospital tourism, medical tourism used to be one of the major pillars of Lebanon's economy. So these are all obviously intertwined, and there's a big question around what happens next on these issues. And then we come to the issue of freedoms. Today, freedom and security. Today, Lebanese are being put forward, are being placed in front of this kind of an equation. Do you have a trade-off? But do you do a trade-off between your freedom and having security? We're seeing a lot more security incidents, clampdown on freedoms, people being persecuted for saying anything and for posting on social media about the president and others. So this clampdown and the shrinking of space is quite problematic and dangerous because Lebanon has always, again, it's part of its DNA, the sense of you can say what you want. It's the one place where, historically in the 60s, this country used to be the safe haven for all the intellectuals, the artists from around the region who were leaving their own countries because they could no longer say what they think. So it was a safe haven for intellectual productivity, creativity, free thinking. If that space goes, that kills one part. And there's a lot of pushback on this. A lot of support that is coming in from the EU in particular, but also from other international organizations and donors on this specific issue. And then the last pillar is security. Security here, we're talking about the role of the army, of course, because it's the one institution where there is still significant support for it amongst the large, broader populace. But again, its role is starting to, be questioned, especially since now we are under emergency powers, and technically the army has the right to go in and pull anybody out from their homes without any prerogatives, where they could actually have people stand before civilians, go before military courts. So there are lots of questions around this issue. More importantly, I think, is that, again, with the collapse in the currency, the local currency, the salaries and pensions of ordinary officers is also collapsing. Some are today something like $300 a month. So it's quite, and this applies also to the internal security services. So all of these cast a lot of questions. At a time when there's obviously a lot of gaps in the security, we're seeing a lot more violent incidents here and there. Just between yesterday and today, there was an outbreak of fighting in between two Christian factions in one part of Beirut. This morning, there was yet another fire, but this time in the iconic Zaha Hadid building in the downtown of the city. So we're seeing a lot of more bizarre incidents happening all over the place, which brings me now to the catastrophic explosion that happened on August 4th. The explosion is, in some ways, I mean, some liken it to Lebanon's 9/11. Yes, in terms of the trauma, it is very much Lebanon's 9/11. People are still, everyone here is still in aftershock. It's something that actually, and it's played an important role, a decisive role in people now deciding to leave the country. I can name scores of people that I personally know who said, that's it, we can't take anymore. But above and beyond that, I think it's actually more of Lebanon's Chernobyl. It's the epitome of this incestuous marriage between a corrupt governance system, a political elite, and a business elite, and the kind of clientelistic networks that they weave with each other. It's bad governance at its best, or at its worst, one can say. The fact that you would allow close to 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate to just languish in the heart of the city. The port of Beirut, the city of Beirut grew around its port. So this is not some isolated port on the outskirts of the city. It's in the middle of a residential area. To allow close to 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate to just languish in the port for almost 6 years. And now, fast forward 40 days after the catastrophic explosion, the port itself has had 2 fires, one of which was incredibly large last week. I mean, I can't even begin to describe the trauma and the panic that people felt when they saw that there was a fire, the fear that we would have yet another explosion. So and then, you know, with 3 fires since then, and now, as I said, there was another fire today. The sense that we still don't know what happened. There has been no accountability until now. Yes, they've taken in I don't know, around 19 people for questioning. Some of the key people who were operating the port are now in custody, but the bottom line is there's still no narrative that tells people what happened and why it happened and how we got here. The subsequent fires raises a lot of questions around the control over the port, the management of this, even all of this investigation. And then the fear that there will be no accountability, that yet once more, there'll be a few scapegoats and then everything will be swept under the rug. Finally, a few words about the role of the French intervention and the role of maybe a couple of words on the role of the EU. In terms of the French intervention, I think for large portions of the population, it was a very welcome intervention in the sense that it was clear that the political class in Lebanon is bottlenecked. There's a real bottleneck. They're unable to reach an agreement on both how to address the economic crisis while they recognize that the country is no more falling into the abyss. It's actually in the abyss, in an economic abyss, and things are deteriorating exponentially. They still have not been able to accept that they need to also share in part of these losses. Effectively, the kind of reforms that need to be done and that will address this economic crisis, some of these reforms are basically asking the political parties to commit a sort of suicide, because you're asking them to let go of their fiefdoms and government agencies, fiefdoms that they've been using to give favors to their networks, but also to siphon funding from state institutions and state projects. Just to take one file, the electricity reform, that is going to have an impact on one of the political parties, but the same would be for the rest. So there's been a lot of resistance to doing that. And the French intervention or the French plan was very welcome in the sense that it seemed to be using a carrot and stick approach. Given the connection of all the political groups in Lebanon with external parties, the sense that even the system had become so bottlenecked that it needs an external mediation to push forward on a stabilization plan. So the French initiative was seen to many people from that perspective. The understanding was that this was being closely coordinated with the Americans and with the Iranians. Because this is where you need to kind of work to at least unlock some of the or nudge people towards some sort of an agreement. And it seemed as if it was going to work. Unfortunately, in the last 24 hours, since Sunday, it became clear that the Americans and the French are not on the same page when it comes to this initiative. The sanctions that came out last week by from the Treasury Department against particularly the former Minister of Finance, who is closely affiliated with the Speaker of Parliament, Nabil Berri. So the sanctions were viewed very negatively, and there are now a lot of bottlenecks around what was actually, from what we were hearing, a potential way out for the country. I'll stop right here, and we can, if you want, I can just, so as not to take more time, and we can get into the details perhaps of the Q&A.
Thanks a lot, Maha. That's great. There are a few questions here, but I'm going to hold off because we haven't much time. We'll go straight to Ambassador Ralph Tariff to give us the point of view from the EU. Over to you, Ralph.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you, Maha, for laying out all this rich detail. I will have a bit of different presentation. I would like to answer the question where we currently stand, and I will be a bit more analytical because I would like to just explain to you or to the audience what the strategic choices are we're currently facing in Lebanon, and whether the government formation succeeds today or in a week or even in a month does not really matter much in terms of these strategic orientations, because there are some very fundamental questions we have to answer. We have now currently, the starting point is that we have now the ambition to form yet another government of technocrats after the government of Diab. The French called it internally gouvernement de mission. I would like to explain at least what is meant by that, the way I understand it. It's not been made explicit, but there are a lot of implicit assumptions which underpin this idea to form government of technocrats or a gouvernement de mission. The first one, and that's possibly the most important assumption, is that we are ready collectively to prioritize the domestic agenda in Lebanon over the geopolitical agenda. You can have a look at Lebanon through two lenses. The one is we need to stabilize the internal situation, the domestic situation. Lebanon needs a certain degree of policies. This is one way of looking at things. The other way was reflected in the number of questions which you have asked, Jim, at the beginning. You know, how do regional powers actually play the geopolitical game? And do we not have to play the geopolitical game also in Lebanon? If you say you want to have a government of technocrats or gouvernement de mission, that means that this government should focus on the domestic agenda and should try to make some progress on the domestic front. That is, if you want, the famous dissociation policy turned on its head or on its feet or whatever, to shield Lebanon from regional rivalries and to create a space where you can actually stabilize the situation in Lebanon. I have to say that not everyone agrees on that, and that is important to understand, not inside Lebanon and not outside Lebanon. So it is a decision you make that you are ready to prioritize the domestic agenda over the geopolitical agenda. Inside Lebanon, we have all this discussion, we have all these protagonists who come out regularly and say we need to address the question of arms of Hezbollah or the question of neutrality in the country before we touch anything else. That is a recurrent topic, and if we don't address the questions of the arms of Hezbollah, we can't do anything in Lebanon because it will always revert to the same thing. So these are two strategic basic orientations. You can't just say 100, it's not a binary code, it's not either or, it's just a question of what you prioritize in a current situation. A government of technocrats also means that you subscribe to a program which I would call a program of modernization of the political and economic system. And there I see three dimensions. The first one is a program of anti-corruption, fighting corruption, fighting the old feudal kind of way of organizing things. That is one thing. There is another dimension to it, which is very, very much anti-establishment. Which means no political leaders should be in the government. It should be technocratic. We should focus on deliverables and not about the political game. So that's the second dimension. And there is a third dimension to it, and that is anti-confessional. You hear regularly that we need in Lebanon a secular state, and the president himself has put this issue on the agenda a couple of days ago. You can bake everything into one cake, and if you bake everything into one cake, then you have the slogan which is on the streets, kullun yani kullun, which is translated means everyone means everyone, which means the political establishment needs to go because the political establishment is corrupt. There is no difference between the political parties. The fight against the corruption is equal to the fight against the establishment. The corruption is entrenched, and the political establishment plays the confessional card in an abusive manner to rally support behind them. So this is where you bake everything together and you don't understand anymore what we're actually talking about. But I think these three dimensions you can clearly detect: anti-corruption, anti-establishment, and anti-confessionalism. Now, there is a strong faction which argues in favor of modernizing on all fronts. And that is, I would say, the international community, in particular the Western donors, the international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, the civil society organizations, think tanks, the 17th of October, the youth, they all rally behind this kind of joint agenda. I'm not so sure that this is really true for most of the Lebanese themselves. Let's go step by step. I don't think that anybody advocates for a system in which corruption prevails, but everybody has learned to navigate it, and everybody is trying and looks for the so-called famous wasta, which mean entry points into the system to survive and to organize their own lives. I don't know a single entrepreneur who says, no, I'm not going to play the corruption game. I have to in order to survive. So everybody plays it. Anti-establishment, there again, I'm not sure that the silent majority is not at the end of the day on the side of the establishment. The traditional leaders still have a power base and command some legitimacy in the eyes of their followers, at least. This is eroding, I agree with Maha, but I believe that the higher the economic stress in the system, the stronger their position is, because they provide services which the state does not provide. So I'm not sure that everybody in Lebanon is anti-establishment, and the traditional leaders are capable of mobilizing their support base when they need it. With regard to the confessional system, this is even more complicated. The society in Lebanon, there is no way around it, is organized around confessional cleavages. There is no political party without a confessional basis. There is a reason for that. It's not that this is has been imposed by ill-meaning people. This is very much reflecting the way how the society organizes itself. So in particular with regard to the anti-establishment and anti-confessionalism, I think this is where the government of Diab failed, because they had a modernizing agenda and they clashed. There was a clash between the technocrats who had a modernizing, at least explicitly a modernizing agenda, and the traditional political leaders, because they didn't allow. And the traditional political leaders prevailed. They succeeded. They brought the government down. Then the next point is on reforms. Again, we talk a lot about reforms. Here, I think we are capable of identifying 5 different dimensions of reforms, and I believe it's necessary to keep them apart. The first one is the political reforms. There we talk about changing the electoral law, or properly implementing or overcoming the Taif agreement, the distribution of power, the confessional arrangements which exist. There is a discussion of creating a Senate next to the lower house. There is, I see currently a great reluctance to engage in Lebanon on this sort of reform agenda, because you don't know if you start that where you will end up. The second dimension of the reform agenda is the fiscal, monetary reforms and the banking sector reforms. This whole set of reforms revolves around the question of the deficit in the central bank in particular, and how to deal with it. This set of issues is the focus currently of the International Monetary Fund, which is trying to negotiate an agreement with Lebanon. The central piece of this reform package is to identify precisely and to allocate, not just to identify, but to allocate the losses in the system. Who is going to foot the bill? We have different numbers ranging from $60 billion to $100 billion, which are not there anymore. Who's going to pay them? How is the burden going to be distributed? This is a very, very complicated, that's the most complicated question in Lebanon today, I believe. And then there are a number of peripheral issues, which we call reforms, which come on the side, like introducing a capital control law, a state budget, a unified exchange rate, a banking sector reform, and all these kind of things. These are things you need to do, but this will not answer you the central question: who's going to foot the bill? Who's going to take over the deficit? The third element of reform, again, is very different from what I've presented now, political and fiscal, is the economic reforms. Economic reforms need to revolve around the question of developing an economic vision and to answer one fundamental question. What is the contribution of Lebanon and the Lebanese economy to a globalized world economy? How are the Lebanese going to get some money in the future? How are they going to basically sustain their living? What is the place of Lebanon in today globalized value chains? The typical answers I get in Lebanon are agriculture, textile industry, tourism, banking services. Seriously? This is how Lebanon wants to survive a globalized economy? These answers are as undercomplex as silly, outright silly. To believe that the tourism sector in Lebanon, with how the place looks like, will have a major contribution to the Lebanese GDP is just not serious. Again, this is a different layer of reforms, economic reforms. The fourth layer is improving the governance. And this is what classically is meant by reforms. So to introduce proper checks and balances in different sectors, in particular the electricity sector, improving the transparency of procedures and decision-making, strengthening the independence of the judiciary, public procurement, rationalization of public procurement, and so on and so forth. These are governance-related reforms. And finally, I would like to add here the whole question of social assistance. We will have very, very soon, or we have already, an extremely impoverished Lebanese society, and there is practically no functioning system of social assistance, including affordable basic healthcare. So that's the fifth layer of reforms. I'm spreading this out because I believe that there is today in Lebanon an implicit, it's not made very explicit, but an implicit but broad agreement on the priorities which need to be followed. I think the first priority now is the reforms in the fiscal, monetary, and the banking sector. To stop the hemorrhage in the financial system and to inject much needed liquidity into the economy, because the economy is bankrupt, not just the state and not just the governmental institutions. There is no money anymore to even pay for basic imports. The IMF is in the lead in this question, and we advocate now openly for an agreement. We have not been doing that in the beginning because this would allow us to trigger macro-financial assistance to Lebanon, which is possibly also needed from the side of the EU. In conjunction with this, I think what is desperately needed, in case there is an INF agreement, is a reform and the setting up of a social assistance mechanism. This is of extreme importance. This is underrated and undervalued, but this is important because the IMF program will come with structural adjustments, and they do not focus, they focus on the fiscal and monetary side of the things. They don't focus as much on the social impact of their program. So this needs to be accompanied by something else. The third priority, I think, is the reforms in the governance sector. This is where we as EU have put a lot on the table and have formulated in detail what we accept. The fourth one is the economic, developing an economic vision of Lebanon in 2030, or whatever you want to call it, 2025, 2040. And the fifth one is the political. All the actors who are relevant have now agreed that the political reforms come at the end and not for the time being. This is a bit the same, like, you know, let's not focus on geopolitics, but on the domestic agenda. So where does the EU stand as an institution? I have already given you some hints, but let me try to summarize. The first, as I said, we are ready and willing to prioritize the domestic agenda and not to play geopolitics in Lebanon. I think there is an agreement within the EU to do that. It's not very explicit, but it's there. You can build on it. It's fragile, I have to say. It depends a bit on the political and in particular the geopolitical dynamics. This can change. This can change anytime, and this depends on events which might trigger change. Second, modernization and reform. I think there the EU is the uncontested champion. This is, I believe, the very essence of the EU. In particular, we have demonstrated this inside the EU to develop transformational potential in countries and in member states in particular through standard setting, the famous acquis communautaire. And we have demonstrated it when we enlarged the European Union. And this is transformational in the proper sense of the word. It transforms political and economic systems. We are capable of doing that. The EU is accompanying transformational changes, but there is one element when we do that, which is very important, and that is ownership of the government, which is our counterpart in doing that. And this is where it becomes complicated in Lebanon, because we cannot do transformational changes by imposing our model on others. Even when it came to the enlargement of the European Union, it was driven mainly by the willingness or by the political will of the decision makers of the countries affected to actually accede to the European Union and to make all the necessary compromises. The same applies outside. I can give you tons of examples where we will not make any progress if the Lebanese government, and I'm not talking about the Lebanese political leaders in general, if the Lebanese government does not play around. our program in Lebanon in general and our program in the neighborhood is not to weaken the state institutions. I'm talking about the state institutions. I'm not talking about mafias. Our program is to empower state institutions, to make them stronger, to make them more resilient. And strong state institutions do not mean repressive state institutions. There's always a confusion there. Strong state institutions are those who deliver services for their citizens. So this is our program. Now, in the MENA region in particular, we are, I have to admit, a bit of self-criticism is also warranted. We are rather status quo oriented. We don't really trigger our transformational potential, and we don't like to trigger our transformational potential. First of all, the governments in place do not want to buy into to that extent. But in the neighborhood, we favor incremental change rather than transformational change. There is a very strong stability and stabilization paradigm built in the European Union policies when it comes to the southern neighborhood. And that is possibly a reflection and a function of the fact that we have defined our interests of the EU with regard to this region in a very defensive way for the longest time. And this was triggered by the two programs of counterterrorism and fight against illegal migration. So that gives you a little bit less appetite to really dramatically inject issues which are transformational. So we rather take it step by step than to bouleverser la scène. Finally, the question of impact and leverage. There is a lot of discussion about our leverage and the impact we can have. Let me differentiate here a number of things. The first one is financial, and the financial in the incentivizing sense of the word. The EU is the single largest donor in Lebanon, and we provide a lot of funds, and we have been ready to contribute to a lot of programs supporting Syrian refugees and host communities, supporting the Cedr process, humanitarian assistance, recovery and reconstruction. Let me tell you one thing. I think the leverage which comes with it is grossly overestimated. People very often think we give all this money. This is why the Lebanese authorities and the Lebanese state has to follow and to abide by whatever we tell them. This is nothing could be more wrong than that. We have a baseline. Our baseline is that we insist on sound financial management. We need to ensure traceability of our funds and that our funds do not go into the wrong direction. But a lot of programs we implement, we do them because they're important in and for themselves. Like, for example, the support for the Syrian refugees, or now we have classically the humanitarian assistance. We are not going to run around and to say you have to do this and that, and we will impose things on you you don't want to undertake in order to disperse the funds. A lot of it, I would say, a big part of it is important in and by themselves. Others, which are not so self-understood, very regularly do not lift off if and when conditioned. A very good example is the Cedr mechanism, which was there for 2 years.
Ralph, I'm sorry to interrupt. Could we do it in about a minute and give a little time for the Q&A? Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Good. Where we were ready to disperse 11 billion euros in infrastructure support investment tied to a reform agenda, this never saw the light of the day. There are other things like the sanctions. The sanctions are a very tricky instrument. The problem with sanctions, I believe, in this region is that it's very often underpinning a geopolitical agenda and not a transformational and reform agenda. I will leave it there, happy to answer questions. Political capital is another issue, which is a matter of leveraging. And this is, as much as the financial leverage is overestimated, this is always underestimated. I think we could do much, much more if we are ready to spend more political capital, and Macron has just demonstrated how that works. Finally, military capacities, we all know that. We don't have much as EU to put on the table. A very final last word on the investigation. The investigation of the Beirut blast is something which we will look very, very carefully into, and we're watching it very closely. We're not very encouraged by what we see right now. But this is something we will let the time play out. But this is something where I would clearly express some disappointment of how the process is going. I will leave it there. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ralph. That's very comprehensive, and from Maha too. I've just got a question which is perhaps slightly naive. but I think is relevant for both of you. Ralph, you laid out the reform agenda, I think, pretty well there. And as you say, it's been the tendency to put political reform on the back drawer, but in fact, it will be something that will follow. But I suppose the obvious question to ask, and maybe Maha can comment here too, is it really possible to deliver all or part of this extremely challenging reform agenda without any change in the underlying political setup of the country? After all, in 2018, a whole series of reforms were promised then, they never materialized, and of course the funds were not flowing. Without that reform agenda being fulfilled in the next few months, is it really possible to imagine that the international community will come forth with the cash that's needed to help the country recover? First, Ralph to answer, and maybe Maha, you can take that question too.
Well, if you look at how as I said, there is a clear sense of priority on what is the most important issue right now. And I think the most important issue right now is to get liquidity into the economy again, because the economy is basically collapsing. Maha has described some symptoms, but you could just go into much more details. If you look at how, and the IMF is negotiating that, if you look at how they go about, they just start in a very, to ask very simple and very precise steps to be taken. And the Lebanese are not ready so far, or the Lebanese government has not been able to rally enough support to even take the very first step. The very first step was a capital control law, which is the most rational thing to do to stop the hemorrhaging of the finances and to give people their money back, their deposits, at least to have a sort of order in this total chaos which exists in the banking sector, and to have a revised state budget for the year 2020. We didn't get any of that, and the IMF has been negotiating for 4 months now. You know, you don't even need to go there and to touch much more complicated things if you can't even organize this for the time being. And eventually, yes, in the long perspective, you're right. There is a reason why the system is where it is right now. But it's a matter of sequencing and prioritizing to get there. If you start today with reforming the electoral law and other issues, this can be done, and there can be a debate about it. Then you reverse the order. You know, I wouldn't say that this is necessarily the wrong thing, and we would certainly lend our support to that. And I think Maha has raised it at some point. That was in November last year, that actually there should be new legitimacy for the political system and new credibility through early elections. Macron, when he was in Lebanon, had this demand for early elections in his package. He had to take it out because there was so much resistance that he understood that he would have to spend all his capital on this one with an uncertain result, rather than push for it. You could possibly push for it. I'm not sure it will deliver, but okay. Maha will know this better.
Maha, if you can also comment, and also if you can add a word on the US position. You pointed out in your intervention about how the US and France and more generally Europe, I think, as Ralph has laid out, are not on the same page when it comes to the sticks involved here. I think you're pretty well placed to give us a comment on that too. Go ahead.
Let me begin with the political versus the economic. I have to disagree with something Ralph said, which is that somehow the reform agenda is a modernization agenda and the traditionalists are against it. It's not a question of modernization versus a traditional approach to governance. It's about a very corrupt, nepotistic, clientelistic approach to governance versus trying to have an institutional functional governance system. This particular government and the efforts it was leading were not about modernization. This was not a coherent government that had a clear agenda it was trying to put forward to try and pull the country out of the abyss or the situation it's in. So having said that, I think the big challenge that the country faces today in terms of pushing forward on economic reform, and actually I would completely agree here that the priority has to be for economic stabilization. The luxury of last November saying that you need to have early elections, and early elections meant elections in 1 year. What we've been calling for, what I personally have been calling for since October, is a small cabinet with exceptional powers to address two key elements: preparing the economic reform plan, stabilization and reform. And the second would be preparing for early elections, i.e. in the space of a year, but at least getting a discussion going on the electoral law. The priority remains economic stabilization. What was possible in November is no longer possible today. The measures needed to be implemented today to stabilize the country financially are far more difficult. For example, one thing that is on the agenda today is the removal of all subsidies, including fuel subsidies. In a country where close to 50% of the population is now poor, below the poverty line, and where there is no functioning public transportation system, removal of the fuel subsidies without a commensurate social protection plan that at least helps those that will need this, will need support, where basically the quality of life for people will deteriorate even further. We're in a situation where we're looking at food insecurity. People will not be able to provide basic calorie needs on a daily basis. So a humanitarian crisis in the making. So stabilization measures that are needed in the short term and that are urgently needed are of a different scale altogether. There is work that is being done on the, and I'm involved in some of initiatives, both as Carnegie, but also as non-Carnegie, in terms of what should be the medium to long-term economic outlook for Lebanon. And Ralph does not rely on tourism and on, this is not what's on the agenda today. In terms of discussions by experts, by civil society organizations, by activists, by whoever, then just a lot of the discussions that I'm part of are really about how to put Lebanon back on track, but with a more sustainable and with an economic model that is fit for purpose in the 21st century. In fact, this afternoon, if anyone, this is a free bit of advertising, we have an event this afternoon on what's next after the Merchant Republic, where we're trying to raise these kinds of questions. And it's a public event. Coming back to the American, so a bottom line is for the kind of reforms to take place that will also unlock the IMF funding. The reason why we need the IMF is we need the immediate dispersal of cash. The IMF is the only institution that can do that and do that very quickly. But it's not just about what money the IMF will bring to the table, but it's that it will unlock, it will give confidence to the EU, as Ralph mentioned, and to others, including the Gulf countries that you mentioned initially, to perhaps support Lebanon financially. Nobody is going to give freebies to Lebanon. There has to be reform. The problem today is that while the political class understands it, again, undertaking these reforms is like asking them to chop off their arms. And that's why they're having a lot of difficulty, and they're still trying to maneuver around undertaking these reforms, are pushing the burden of the economic adjustment on ordinary depositors. And we don't have enough time for that. So I think the question, if what comes first, the economy or the political, I would say it's no longer a question. The priority is economic. But it's not about political reform, but actually, and this is where the French initiative was important, is to try and push the political class, because they do hold the levers of power and they are major spoilers in any system. The urgency today is to get them to accept that they will have to also bear some of the losses in order to stabilize Lebanon. It's in their self-interest also, because unless they want to go back to a situation where each political head is literally the ruler, the king of his own, or of his own hill. I was about to say her, but actually they're all males. And so unless they want to go back to a situation where they're all the kings of their own little hill and their own little neighborhood, the country is literally collapsing. So they have to work together and accept that they need to share some of the burden. And this is where the reforms come in. And this is where the French initiative was important, because it was trying to do the carrot and the stick, saying, it's in your self-interest to come together to an agreement, put forward the cabinet. I know some of the names that were proposed. These are top-notch names that really are the kind of leadership we need for this particular moment in Lebanon's history, this particularly precarious and existentially threatening moment in Lebanon's contemporary history. On the American position, very quickly, the Americans, I think, there is obviously, as we've seen from the sanctions, my sense now is that no, they're not on board. They see the French initiative as Ralph pointed out. They see the French initiative as one that is giving a free pass to the current political parties, particularly Hezbollah. And by the way, Hezbollah is very keen on stabilizing the country. So just for us to be also clear on that particular issue. So they see it as giving Hezbollah and Iran a free pass, and therefore they want to kind of maximize on the using the stick, the threat of sanctions. Also, there's this sense that I get, and I may be mistaken here, is that that the elections are coming up. They want to maximize on the impact that they kind of, in terms of sanctions and the pressure on Hezbollah, on Iran, prior to the elections, so that should there be a shift in the leadership, it's very difficult to walk back from what has already been accomplished. This is my reading. I may be wrong, but given Pompeo's op-ed in Le Figaro this morning, statements that have been coming out of the State Department, and everything we've been seeing in terms of public, statements, this is my reading of where the Americans are today. Unfortunately, this spells disaster for Lebanon, because if we don't have a government in place in the next few days, then I think we're going to see a rapid deterioration in both the economic, but also in the political situation.
Yeah.
And
thanks,
security.
Maha. Thank you, Maha. There's quite a few questions coming in on the wider role that's being played by others in Lebanon. I think the joke in Lebanon is that just about every state you can think of has interfered in Lebanon except for the Lebanese state, because of the lack of visits to the bomb site and all the rest of it. Turkey mentioned here. Would you care to comment on the Turkish role, if any, in Lebanon right now? And perhaps also related to some extent, because we have Hezbollah on the agenda, we have a number of questions there too. Some are pretty skeptical that so long as Hezbollah is an armed organization, it is going to continue to cause trouble internally, and you're going to have great difficulty settling the country down. Would either of you care to comment on both of those points?
Sure, I can take a couple if you want. Just a few comments on first on Turkey's role. Turkey historically has, built up relationships over the years with primarily the Sunni community and mainly in the north of Lebanon. And it's been more visible over the past, I would say, year or two, particularly through its cultural. It's been employing soft power through cultural networks, youth, clubs, etc. But I wouldn't say that, at least up till now, I wouldn't say that it's a major power or that it's affecting the way things are developing in Lebanon. It's not playing a very big role. Doesn't mean it won't. It's playing the role of, spoiler on the ground sometimes, but nothing really, from what I can tell, not playing a significant role in terms of which direction the country is going through. And that doesn't mean it won't play a more significant role down the road. I don't know whether Turkey has the bandwidth, especially because the Sunni community, in a sense, is orphaned at this point, with Saudi Arabia withdrawing its support. Over the years, it's not just about Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri, as the popular myth is, but it's been withdrawing its support since 2008, I would say, even from major institutions like the Maqasid that it had historically been, NGOs we're talking. So that's on one side in terms of Turkey. In terms of Hezbollah, addressing Hezbollah or dealing with the Hezbollah arms issue is not a local, it's not something that the Lebanese can do on their own. This is going to be part of any regional settlement that takes place. it's going to be on the table of discussion for any regional settlement. After all, let's just remember that it was a regional and international settlement, which was the Ta'if Agreement, that allowed Hezbollah to remain arms. The Ta'if Agreement, which ended the civil war, was under American, Iranian, Saudi support. It was under their umbrella, and it is that agreement that allowed Lebanon to remain under Syrian influence. I think it was the prize given to Syria for supporting the Americans in the Gulf War, but also that allowed Hezbollah to remain arms. So addressing this is going to be part of another regional settlement. It's not something the Lebanese can do on their own. And okay. That's on that side. And I'm talking about the arms.
Okay, we're almost out of time, but over to Ralph, and to add, if you'd like to comment on either of those aspects, but a direct question for you, Ralph, has come in. When you said that leverage that comes with donor aid is overrated, do you have to accept that, or can the EU address it? This is a direct question to you, but I'll leave it to you to finish off with the answers. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's not that we just accept it. It's just to think that we can leverage, impose certain things. This is about leverage through development assistance or through humanitarian assistance is, I believe, overrated. It's a difficult balancing act. There are certain things which we can achieve through being development assistance, and there are other things which we cannot. I can give you a specific and concrete example. We're currently now discussing the reconstruction of the port of Beirut. We have very clear ideas how a modern port management system should look like. And of course, we don't just come in with money. We come with all the program of, we want to build the port according to modern standards and modern criteria. And this has been laid out open to everybody, how the port was managed, and from our perspective, mismanaged. But you need to see, first of all, that not every actor is interested in that. And there are possibly on the ground certain actors which are not interested in that. And then we have competition. We have other players who do not care about standards of management of a port. So you need to see what kind of influence you can have. What we want is pretty clear and pretty solid. Whether we will be able to achieve it is a different question. Whether we need to make some compromises on the way is also another question. It's much more complicated than it looks like on the outset. To believe that we commit a certain agreement of amount of money and then everything falls into place just because we have committed an amount of money underestimates the importance of internal calculations of those who make the decisions, because they might be more interested in other schemes which they can exploit to their advantage further. On Hezbollah, I think at the latest with the Security Council Resolution 1559, which lays down the vision of a Lebanon which is sovereign, which has as a sovereign state, which should have as a sovereign state, how is it called, the legitimate the sole or the exclusive use of legitimate sources of power. This is our vision. We are all for it. The question, how do you go about it? And I agree with Maha that this is something which cannot be done in Lebanon alone. You could prioritize. You could say, I don't care about Lebanon. I'm not going to reconstruct the port of Beirut. I want to address the arms of Hezbollah. This is a matter of how you prioritize your political goals. And then you say, I don't care about the stability of Lebanon. I don't care of the well-being of the people of Lebanon, but I don't care also what we create if we destabilize the situation. It's a question of, as the strategic goal, I think there cannot be a question about it. The question is, how do you go about it tactically? And it's not that it has not been tried, even to disarm Hezbollah militarily. It's been tried at least twice or 3 times. It was not proven a very successful endeavor. So I agree with Maha. This needs to take place in a regional discussion, in a discussion amongst the major regional powers, where you find an understanding of how to deal with these things. The arms of Hezbollah are mostly, I'm not saying exclusively, but mostly used outside Lebanon and not inside Lebanon.
Thank you, Ralph. I think we've come to the end of this discussion. We've only just managed to skate over the surface. This is an extraordinarily complex and challenging time for what certainly personally I consider to be a great country. I mean, I do hope, I think we all hope, that the recovery comes soon, that the well-being of the people improves. We need, all of us, I think, to see Lebanon back on its feet. You guys are doing what you can on the spot to do that. Wish you well. And thank you to all of our participants for coming in. Sorry we didn't cover all of the questions, but we just didn't have the time. But in any event, thanks to all, and let me wish you a very good day and week ahead. All the best. Take care.
Thank you very much for organizing.
Thank you, James. Bye-bye.